This podcast is presented by the Prince George's County Memorial Library System.
Hello, I'm Darlene, one of the editors for the These Books Made Me podcast. For the Their Eyes Were Watching God episode, we were lucky enough to have 2 expert interviews, one of which you heard during last week's episode. This week, we're releasing the second interview, where Hannah is joined by Bill Wasik and Monica Murphy, authors of the book Rabid, A Cultural History of the World's Most Diabolical Virus. Our experts give us further insight into rabies, the disease that tragically afflicts Tea Cake in Hurston's novel.
So thank you so much for being here today. Would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about yourself and your background and your book, Rabid, A Cultural History of the World's Most Diabolical Virus?
Sure. My name is Bill Wasik, and I'm an editor at the New York Times Magazine.
My name's Monica Murphy, and I'm a veterinarian in New York City.
And we're married, and we live in Brooklyn, New York, but we are originally from Gaithersburg, Maryland, so we're thrilled to be talking to a Maryland audience. A number of years ago, we got really interested in rabies, which is a subject that Monica knows a bit about from her background in veterinary medicine and also in public health. And so decided to write a book about the history of it, and not just the science of it, but about the way in which you can find references to rabies throughout the history of the world. And it's called Rabid, A Cultural History of the World's Most Diabolical Virus. And we're very happy to be here.
That's such a cool project to work on with both of your, different backgrounds and perspectives, like sort of the veterinary medical background and then the journalism writing background. So I like how I'm reading it right now, full disclosure. My coworker, Ella, suggested it. She loved the book. So we were so glad you agreed to come on and talk with us. I love how you kind of make the scope so broad, like you really start in ancient Greece. I think it's one of the places.
Before that even, you see references to rabies going all the way back to the Sumerians and the Akkadians, like the very first written language.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it was neat. I mean, I think one of the things that made it such a unique way to write about history is that there are these sorts of breadcrumbs of references to rabies throughout history, enough to kind of hit so many different places and times over many thousands of years, but not so many that you can't sort of reference most of them in a relatively short book for a general audience. And so it was a fun project, not just because there are references to rabies from so many different parts of history, but there aren't that many of them. And so it was possible to really summarize most of what was there before the 19th century. Obviously at the 19th century, there's an explosion of more, medical understandings and attempts to combat rabies. But in the earlier parts of the chronology, there's a nice manageable amount of stuff to write about.
So it's really been with us a long, long time in human history, it sounds like.
Yeah, and there's science that they've done studies with looking at the phylogenetic tree of the virus where they actually have a working theory about when it jumped to humans.
Remember when that was?
Well, I can't remember, but it was many thousands of years ago. It supported the idea that these would have been or could have been references to rabies in these very early tablets. As we get into in the book, it's like the language is very, very suggestive of it being rabies. But of course, our understanding of these very, very ancient tongues, is always very provisional. And so we can't say for sure, but the virological record, or however you call it, does support the idea that there would have been rabies circulating in these in the earliest
dogs.
Culture. Right, in dogs.
Because that's really where it gets in the way of people, is when rabies is circulating in dogs. Because dogs live so closely with us, that really creates a heightened risk that humans are going to be exposed to the virus.
Right, because it's like you said, where we interact so closely with dogs. And I mean, it's present in wild populations too, I think, but we don't get as close to those necessarily all the time.
Yeah. And I think that in North America right now, where it's been eliminated in dogs, when an animal comes out of the forest and attacks us in daylight, we know something's wrong there. And I think with only a little bit of information about rabies, you still are likely to think to approach a doctor about whether you need some care in the aftermath of being bitten by a fox or a raccoon or a bobcat or a skunk. And when rabies is circulating in dogs, I mean, we mostly have wonderful interactions with dogs, but there are also some negative interactions with dogs. And it's more of a puzzle. Was that dog defending her puppies or her house or her food bowl, or is her behavior deranged by rabies? Should I invest a large part of my family's income in seeking care for that when it might be nothing? I think those are trickier calculations, even in today's era where there is treatment available for rabies, and that's true around the world. So, although in some places it's easier to get than others.
Yeah, I know. I think you touched on your book about how, there's a perception that rabies treatment will be more unpleasant than it is. So my dad had an encounter with an animal as a kid, and it was probably in the 60s, and he had to have the horrible series of shots in your stomach, week after week, which I think it's no longer quite that unpleasant to get treated, even though there might be financial barriers to it.
Right. It's and that's been true for decades, that it's down to just a handful of injections over a couple of weeks, and it goes in your arm. So it's much less unpleasant than what we may have heard about on the schoolyard, even in the 80s. Even then it was not sort of what the public perceived it to be.
So my next question is, I think you touched on it a little when you introduced yourself and talked about your book, but wanted to ask, what made you decide to write a book about the cultural history of rabies?
Well, I having a veterinarian as a spouse and one who's interested in infectious diseases, Monica would often come and tell me interesting stories about, a paper she had seen about rabies in a veterinary journal, or little factoids about sort of how crazy, rabies behavior is inside the body. It crawls up the nerve sheathings, which is only, I think, one or two other viruses do. So I thought, I should go and maybe buy a history of rabies for Monica. And I was shocked to find that there weren't any. There weren't, popular books, but there weren't really single volume academic histories of rabies either. And so I got it in my head that it would be fun for us to collaborate on one.
There was no book, so you decided to write it.
Exactly.
I believe that in your book, Rabies: A Cultural History, you discuss the portrayal of rabies in Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is the book that this episode of our podcast is focusing on. Could you tell us a little bit about your thoughts about that part of the book and how you discussed it in your own? Is it an accurate portrayal of the effects of the rabies virus? Any thoughts about it?
Well, it's quite devastating to read about tea cake's illness. And I think that the book draws upon the horror of rabies to really help you empathize, with the loss that Janie suffers. But it, I think, fairly accurately draws from what was known about rabies at the time, in terms of its mode of transmission, the treatments available, your sort of options once you're already sick, and the dangers to the people who take care of someone sick with rabies, which is, I think, maybe that last part is where it maybe isn't quite what we think right now.
You mean in terms of tea cake actually biting her, which is something that was often part of the mythology of rabies, but isn't really
that
real.
Sick humans bite bite their caretakers. It's very true that rabies attacks the sort of primitive part of the brain, where a lot of really core emotions live, including rage and maybe jealousy. I don't think that's a far stretch of the imagination. And the person suffering from rabies really might be furious with those around him or her. When humans feel fury and rage, though, biting isn't sort of our natural way we act that emotion out the way it is for a dog. So although humans do have infectious saliva when they're suffering from rabies, the biting isn't I don't think a real likely way that they're going to manifest their symptoms unless they're a very young child. I have read credible reports that very young children suffering from rabies have bitten their caretakers and transmitted rabies to them that way.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Which makes sense, because I think the idea is that rabies will provoke a response that's like natural to the...
Yeah. I mean, I honestly think sort of reaching for the gun was maybe the more plausible way a human might act out, the sort of stimulation of their limbic system. Punching people in the face, I think, is frequently reported from rabies sufferers, because that's a very human way to act out rage. I do think that there was a lot she got right about this scenario in which a couple, one member of a couple is afflicted this way. And given what we know about Janie and Tea Cake, I found this to be a plausible and touching sort of scene.
One thing that she gets right is that I do think is part of what makes rabies such a sort of dramatic and tragic affliction is the time that elapses, the weeks that elapse, but sometimes it's even longer, that can elapse between when you're bitten by an animal and when the human being begins to show signs of the illness, which is so, if you don't have access to post-exposure vaccination as we do today, is part of what has made rabies so terrifying throughout the ages, because you sort of don't know during this long waiting period whether this fatal infection is going to manifest itself. And so that's something I think that she gets right in the book.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem that if they had known to be concerned about rabies and had talked to the doctor about it early, that they might have had access to post-exposure vaccination. And I think one thing that makes the scene really poignant is the idea that the doctor has sent for the serum that might arrive and save the day. We know now, and I think it's possible because of the way she wrote it that Zora Neale Hurston knew then that TK couldn't have been saved by that serum. Janie thinks that maybe he will be, but by the time rabies symptoms are manifest, it's a death sentence with the rarest exceptions. And those very rare exceptions, not to get too far afield from what happens in the book, but those very rare exceptions that we know about are mainly in the last couple of decades and in very intensive care settings with induced comas. And so really outside the scope of this book. I kind of think from the way she wrote it that Zora Neale Hurston, the author, knew, and that the doctor character probably knew that it was hopeless, but was sort of throwing out the serum idea as a last ditch, got to do something kind of therapy without any real optimism that it was going to save the day. Because in point of fact, it wouldn't. Mm-hmm. Once symptoms are manifest, the vaccine, the immunoglobulin therapies, which can be so useful given after a bite, they don't help the patient. There's some evidence they hurt the patient.
You have to treat it before it gets to the point where they're,
So essentially the interval in which you can treat rabies is the interval between when the animal bites and when the rabies virus makes its way up the peripheral nervous system into the brain.
So you have to interrupt that process.
Yep. And so there's actually a temporal relationship between sort of, if you get bitten on your toe, you might have longer to get that vaccination than if you get bitten on your face.
Oh, interesting. I didn't realize that it was as variable as that based on like where in your anatomy.
It actually crawls along the nerves, and it doesn't have as far a distance to travel, obviously, if you're bit on your cheekbone like tea cake.
Right.
If you're bit on your big toe.
Truly a terrifying virus. Did you learn anything surprising to you or new about rabies or the place it occupies in our culture while you were researching and writing this book? Obviously, you went in with some foreknowledge with your veterinary background.
Well, I mean, sure, we learned.
Yeah, I mean, no, it was so fun how much we learned. You know, one of the most fun parts of researching the book, and I hope of reading the book, is all of the cures throughout history, the sort of ways in which different cultures and different eras sort of believed it was possible to cure rabies or to sort of keep a dog bite, you know, from turning into a rabies infection. And, you know, a lot of it is sort of comical, and a lot of it is sort of scary or sort of disturbing or disgusting. We really loved going to this basilica in Belgium, where the medieval dog bite sufferers would go to sort of take the holy cure against rabies under the protection of Saint Hubert, you know, who was the patron saint of the hunt and also of rabies sufferers, and was the person the saint you would appeal to in hoping to survive or not get rabies. In terms of the present day stuff, and I mean, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what you saw in Bali, because I did think that a lot of sort of what it looked like to try to stop a rabies outbreak, which was something that Monica saw when she went to Bali in the middle of a rabies outbreak there, I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, it's because Bali is a small island, and because it had been able to remain rabies free until relatively recently, when they had a single dog introduction of rabies, it really just took off through their dog population and led to a bunch of terrible human deaths. Because it's such a small place, we were really able to piece together a plausible theory for exactly when it came in and who was affected first, and sort of how it made its way from village to village across the island. And it was also a great laboratory for public health and international humane organizations to get in there and try out ways to stop it. And it was wonderful to see sort of the power of vaccination in shutting down an epidemic, or epizootic is what we call an epidemic in animals. And of course, it took real nerve and bravery for the people on the front lines to go around catching these semi-feral dogs to administer vaccination. So it was a real sort of adventure to see these teams in action. So I feel like maybe the takeaways that are relevant to sort of the current pandemic are notional. It is, for me, it's a meaningful model of a new disease and a naive population, and the way public health can sort of operate at its best to help, and the sort of resistance you get from people who don't want to change the way they've been doing things before the virus arrives, and people who want to take sort of draconian measures, let's kill all the dogs on the island of Bali, versus people who are nervous about subjecting their dogs to vaccines. It's fascinating stuff, and it's interesting, just as it's interesting to look at sort of the history of the smallpox vaccinations and stuff too, to apply that to sort of the way human nature continues to interact with infection and vaccination and so forth. I think another place in our book where that's relevant is in the chapter about Louis Pasteur's development of the rabies vaccine, which was a truly tremendous achievement. And it's the technology upon which, like all our current vaccines, sort of their starting point. And it's sort of amazing to find how even when it came out, it's only recognized by some people for the sort of modern miracle it is. And for others, it's very, very scary. So that certainly has a lot of relevance now.
Yeah, it really resonates, feels extra topical. I didn't know that Pasteur was involved in the rabies vaccine. I think I associated him with different vaccines. That he was the smallpox guy as well. Right?
Jenner's a smallpox guy, and he was decades out in front of Pasteur. But whereas Jenner kind of uses an existing animal virus to produce immunity to a human scourge, Pasteur is the first scientist, and he does this first in animals and some animal diseases, and then moves to rabies. His techniques involve taking an organism into the laboratory and weakening it, and then letting it back out into the world to induce immunity so that you're protected from the natural infection. And that, to me, is the great leap forward. Of course, not to neglect.
You wish you could discover, for every scary virus, you wish you could discover a related virus that was not very deadly but would give us immunity. Which is essentially what Jenner was able to do with smallpox. But of course, we don't have that for almost any of other.
Anyway, I just love Pasteur as a subject, and I think it was very gutsy of him because to sort of make the conscious choice that he wants to sell the world on this idea that you can attenuate natural infections and make them protect you from disease, and so he goes after the scariest infection out there in rabies, because he knows it'll just be a blockbuster if he can save those lives. It's a blockbuster because then, as now, like, rabies just terrified people out of proportion to how much harm it did sort of on the community level. And it affects children more than it affects adults. So it just tugs at your heart. And he just went for it. And I just, there's so much sort of natural drama there. I just love his story.
I'm conflating my public health figures here, but would definitely owe them huge depth for doing that work. And I feel like you just sort of touched on in part of the answer for maybe the next question that I'm posing, which is like, what do you think it is about rabies that makes it as horrifying in our cultural consciousness and in reality as it is, because it truly is a terrifying virus. I don't think anybody would disagree with that.
I mean, one of the ways that we thought about it, and partly how we framed the book, is that, most of our infectious diseases come to us out of animal populations. Certainly emerging infectious diseases are coming to us out of animal populations, just like the COVID-19 virus did from bats or pangolins or sort of whatever combination it was. But but rabies is the one virus where throughout history you sort of visibly see the animal infecting the human, which is of course just a really powerful like cross-cultural idea, right? I mean, the notion that animals and humans are I mean, this is what has made Charles Darwin a controversial figure to this day, right? And so many religions have mythologies or cosmologies that involve, animals having their place and humans having their place, and the notion that an animal can bite a human, and that over time, then the human begins to show not exactly the same symptoms as the animal, but the sort of visible signs that the animal has infected the human. That's just a really like powerful, I mean, it creeps us out even to this day, right? To hear about viruses coming out of animals, and it's visible with rabies.
And to bring it back to Sarah Neil Hurston, when Tea Cake's infected, she starts using language to describe him, like him snarling and lifting his lip at Janie. And she describes him walking with this swinging, loping gait, which I'm actually not sure if that's how people affected by rabies might walk. It is how dogs affected by rabies kind of walk. I felt like she was using language that sort of brought all that to mind, and it just sort of doubled down on the horror of it, that he's essentially being characterized as increasingly animal like as the virus takes hold of him.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we spent a while talking about sort of how medically accurate it would be, but of course this is a work of literature, and it's worth sort of acknowledging that part of what I think makes it, even if it's a kind of like Gothic plot twist, like part of what I think makes it powerful is that it underscores the sort of like almost like cosmically doomed aspect of their relationship. But it also underscores the sort of, because there's, if I recall correctly, there's a bit of a sort of violence to their relationship even before this incident. Isn't that right?
Yes, I think so. I'm doing my reread, but I do think there is some hint of some conflict with their relationship, if I remember right.
But just the sense of it almost bringing out something that was like already there in his nature, and I think that's a way in which you see rabies deployed. I mean, I think a lot about Old Yeller, which is, the sort of classic way that a lot of Americans have like had a rabies story like brought into their lives, and the sense that something that the incident with the dog getting bit, and then the dog, in the book version, I think the boy kills the dog before it demonstrates signs of rabies, and in the movie, I think they wait until the dog is snarling or whatever, but it's against this backdrop of a kind of like hard scrabble sort of pioneer like life where the forces of nature that have to be mastered to sort of live in that environment feel almost symbolized by the way in which they visit themselves on the dog, it's almost like, it's almost like the violence of nature itself is like bearing down on the beloved dog, in that moment. And I think that the horror type uses of rabies in a book like Cujo or other, there are lots of horror movies that have used rabies or something that feels a lot like rabies. And it's in there, it almost takes on a sort of, it's like almost a supernatural version of rabies as kind of like power to transform animals into something more like monsters or to sort of be the most animalistic versions of themselves. And so, I mean, coming around to your question of what makes rabies so horrible, I think that it, in the way that it's used, kind of literally used or used in a sort of figurative way in so many narratives, I think it's because it sort of symbolizes this like animalistic violence, and whether it's humans that are seized with it or whether it's animals that are sort of seized with it, like there's something about that basic story that's just incredibly scary to us. And it's something that has its roots, like, in a kind of pre-civilized, world or like reality.
It's a virus. It's a primeval curse. It's the wrath of nature.
Exactly.
Definitely has some weight to it. So my next question is, do you think that there's enough accurate information and public health messaging about rabies out there for the general public to have, sufficient info to know the risks, know how to prevent, know how to treat?
I worked in a local health department for a couple of years, and we were actively pushing out messages about, avoiding wildlife and seeking treatment if you have a dangerous contact with wildlife. That same office would be the one that would be on the front lines of fighting coronavirus these last 2 years. And I would imagine, although I'm not in that world now, that rabies work would maybe, be sort of on the back burner right now. Of course, at the national level, we are lucky that there are people working at the CDC entirely on rabies and continuing to try to get the word out about how dangerous it is to have contact, in particular with bats. And we saw some press releases in just the last several weeks related to a series of rabies cases in the United States occurring related to bat contact. I think that with such a sort of infrequent and idiosyncratic pattern of illness and death in the United States, and it's only a handful a year, I can understand why we don't hear more about it than we do. But of course, we'd love for everybody to know that if you have contact with wildlife, and in particular, if you have any physical contact with bats, you need to sort of get in touch with healthcare or public health to assess the need for rabies vaccine, because rabies deaths are entirely preventable with vaccination.
I think that one thing that we find a lot of people are surprised to hear us say when we talk about rabies risk is that bat bites can often be very subtle. So you might be bit by a bat. Some people can be bit by bats while they're asleep and not necessarily.
Usually, yeah. Well, I mean, and in particular, in areas that have a fair amount of bat rabies, someone reporting a bat being in their room when they're asleep might be questioned about, how deep a sleeper they are, that to sort of screen them for the need for post-exposure vaccination. But certainly, if I were to have a toddler sleeping in another room and open the door to find a bat in there, I'd probably want to seek post-exposure care for that young child who couldn't report exposure, because we wouldn't necessarily find a wound. And yeah, it's that bat contact, of course, it sort of defies that generalization I made earlier about if a skunk comes out of the woods and bites your ankle, you kind of have a pretty good idea that you need care. But waking up in a room with a bat and a hangover, meaning you might have been really knocked out the night before, you might not know you need care. So those, I do think that it would be great to get the word out more that as much as we love bats and we need them ecologically, and they are a core species for our ecosystem to function properly and to help, get rid of mosquitoes, which cause disease, for example. The net good they do in the world is way in their favor, but when humans come in contact with them, there are important questions to be asked about whether there's a need for post-exposure rabies vaccination.
It seems like a really tricky balance to find, to not demonize bats and make people afraid and want them to be destroyed, because like you said, they're useful and they're, a good species to have around for so many reasons, but treat them with caution.
When you edit this, I hope you figure that out, because it's truly important that we have bats, and we wouldn't want them away from homes even because of the sort of ecosystem services they provide. For instance, getting rid of mosquitoes that might give you West Nile, and I think I don't have these numbers in my head, but I would expect that West Nile is still causing more fatalities every year. Certainly mosquito-borne encephalopathies are causing more harm in the United States than rabies is at present. So the idea that you'd, do anything to bats that might increase your exposure to bugs sort of seems, I don't know. And the point just being that even though we do want to get out public health messaging around being very careful when you've had close contact with a bat, it is definitely, this is not an anti-bat message. We love our bats. We need our bats.
Absolutely. Well, we do a blog post for each episode, one of which is a deep dive, and maybe we'll try to write a nuanced roundup of information on bats and rabies that tries to balance that delicate message. Maybe we'll ask you for some recommended sources or talking points just to, make sure we're
because to your question, if we're talking about, ways that we can improve messaging in the United States, that's it. That's the whole game, because almost everybody in the United States who's died of rabies in the last couple of decades, with just a couple of exceptions,
it is acquired in the United States.
Well, that's what I was going to say. You either get rabies because you had bat exposure or because you had dog exposure outside the U.S. in an area that still got dog exposure. That makes up by far most of the rabies cases, which are rare in the United States. So the people seem to have the message about foxes and raccoons and skunks and other larger animals with respect to bite exposures, but they do not yet appreciate the risk from rabies. And you read about mass exposures where kids bring a bat in for show and tell that they found on the ground, and resulting in large numbers of school children needing post-exposure vaccination. I hope people are continuing to work on good nuanced messaging around this issue, because we do need to be careful about bat exposure without being bat negative, if you will.
Makes sense. So I thought I'd close it out with an open-ended question. Is there anything I didn't ask about that you wanted to share, mention, or talk about today?
Well, we didn't talk about horror tropes. One of the subjects of the book that a lot of people ask me about, at least, are the question of, we have a chapter in the book where we sort of talk about the uncanny resemblance between a lot of our classic horror tropes, by which I mean specifically the zombie myth, the vampire myth, and the werewolf myth, that all have some degree or other of resonance with rabies. And what I found in my investigation of the history of those was that there was far from a clear-cut case that rabies, 100% influenced any of them, in part because those tropes have actually all evolved over the years in very interesting ways, in some ways becoming kind of more rabies-like in their behavior over time. But nevertheless, I do think it's funny and interesting, sort of back to this point about the animal affecting the human, to think about how many of our horror tropes share that basic resonance with rabies, that you have these humanoid creatures that either, they get bitten and then they suddenly want to bite somebody else and sort of pass on the infection, so to speak, in the case of the vampire, or, the werewolf, where you're affected and then you suddenly become literally animalistic, in your physical form. And, the zombie movies, in some ways, the most recent resonance of rabies with horror movies have really been in these zombie movie type things. I Am Legend has a very rabies-like kind of story that threads through it. And 28 Days Later, the Danny Boyle film, literally was inspired by rabies and the idea of a rage virus that affects human beings or so on. So I do think it's really interesting, just the way that there's this kind of family tree of horrors in the human, certainly in the Western or American or Anglo-American kind of world, and that rabies kind of sits right there in the middle of them in this fascinating way.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it really does touch on those horror tropes. And when in zombie movies, just the idea of the bite that you have that you don't know if it's going to turn you into something not yourself, or are you hiding it from your companion? You're trying to, I mean, all those other
That's
tropes.
Right. That's right. Are you really still human? Or are you this other more animal thing? I mean, that is so much of the drama in zombie stories derives from that question.
Yeah, I think that's it's really interesting stuff. So, unless there's something else I wanted to bring up, I think we'll end it there. And thank you so much for your time, both of you. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us for this episode.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
I learned so much from this discussion, and I hope you did too. Thank you for listening, and join us next week for a new episode.